Module 7, Lesson 2. And as I just told you guys, but I'll tell people at home, there's only 3 lessons in this module, and so it's not, it doesn't have 4 or 5 like most of the other modules, so it's a little bit shorter. But it's all about, Lesson 1 was all about manifest destiny. Who can tell me what manifest destiny is? What is it? What is manifest destiny? What this entire chapter is about? Brian. That's exactly right. It's the idea that the United States is destined by God to be a coast-to-coast nation, and nothing can get in the way of that. Not Mexicans, not Indians, nothing. Okay, is the idea that it's obvious, it is manifest that America will be a coast-to-coast nation, and in order to do this, America has to expand outward. Okay, and so today what we're going to look at is the expansion into Texas, all right? Because Texas was not part of the United States. Texas belonged someplace else. So, going back in time, during, who was the big empire that controlled a lot of this, the Central America type place? Well, the Spanish, okay? So for about 3 centuries of Spanish rule in Mexico, only a few thousand Mexican settlers had migrated into what is now the land area known as Texas. So it wasn't a heavily populated area, even though had lots of natural resources. It had a climate that was good for agriculture, and there just happened to be a lot of friction that existed between the Native Americans that were there and the Mexican inhabitants of the area. So, since the earliest of the Spanish settlements, many of the people who there never really came in close contact before. But Mexico becomes its own country in the year 1821 when it wins independence. When it wins its independence in 1821. But there were and still are remnants of Spanish control of the area. And one of those remnants is in the form of missions. What is a mission? Not like the verb, but a noun. Mission. What is a mission? Okay, that's the verb. Yeah, I want the noun. And they do that in a place called a mission. Okay, so what Jonathan said is it's a place where religious conversions happen. And the religion that was of the Spanish was what? Roman Catholic. Okay, so there were lots of Roman Catholic missions that were sprinkled all throughout the former Spanish territory. And these missions, their job was to try to convert the Native Americans that were there and then help them to settle on the land. So, do you think the missions were very popular? Not amongst some. Amongst some Native Americans, they were very popular and they loved the message. Others resisted. And so, in an effort to protect the missions, they would send soldiers to live near the mission. And it would, when a soldier would build a place that is fortified, it's called a fort. A fort that was built by the Spanish to protect the mission is called a presidio. Presidio. It's just a Spanish fort. That's a presidio. And the purpose of these forts was to protect the missions. And this is when it was under Spanish rule, okay? Now, as time passes and Mexico becomes Mexico and has its own country, the mission system, the system where there's a mission, like a place where there's religious conversions to Catholicism and forts to protect it, it kind of goes by the wayside. It declines in the 1820s and 1830s after Mexico won its independence. And, Mexico kind of takes a different approach toward the Native Americans. Not necessarily making them slaves, but forcing them to remain as unpaid laborers. I know, a worker with, that doesn't get paid, that kind of sounds like a slave to me, even though slavery was not allowed in Mexico. So anyway, they were forced to work, and how do you think some of those Native American groups felt about that? They didn't like it very much. And so what do you think they did to resist the Mexicans forcing them into labor? They fought back. And some of the more hostile groups of Native Americans were the Comanche and the Apache. Ever heard of them? Comanche and Apache. And they retaliated by sweeping through the land, stealing livestock, terrorizing settlers. And the settlers that were from Mexico and settled in the area of Texas are called Tejanos. Tejanos. That's how you spell it. It's the last word up there. So a Tejano is a person from Mexico who settles in Texas. Tejano. Okay. So things are changing in that area. It's a massive shift from Spanish ownership to Mexico being its own independent nation. And so the people of Mexico want to begin to utilize its neighbors to do trade. Who is Mexico's wealthiest neighbor? The United States. And so Mexico's northern provinces, Texas, trade opportunities between those two places are growing exponentially. And Tejanos, the settlers that live there, are raising livestock, mostly in the form of longhorn cattle. Which provide things like tallow, hides, and other commercial goods, which they could easily trade in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as there was a railroad and a trail, not a railroad, but there was a trail from Santa Fe to points west and east. So, Mexico's seeking out to improve its economy by easing trade restrictions and making more trade opportunities attractive between the United States and themselves. But pretty soon they run into some problems. You ever seen Texas on a map? Like today's present-day state of Texas? Give me some characteristics. It is enormous. It is large. It is our second largest state geographically. And Mexico found out that just because you have a vast territory didn't necessarily mean that you could control it. All right? It's very difficult to control. The nation's capital of Mexico, which is Mexico City, lay very far from Texas. Texas was pretty far from Mexico. Mexico City is right in the central part of Mexico. So, and they all, so Mexico City, it seems so far away, and so the problems of Texas seemed, not very important to them. They seemed kind of indifferent. So when Native American groups like the Apache and the Comanche continue to threaten the Tejanos there, the people are resentful of the government. They don't like that Mexico City is kind of abandoning their problems, even though they are Mexican citizens. Does that make sense? Okay. So consequently, the Mexican government began to look for new ways to strengthen ties between the northern provinces and Mexico City. All right. So, one of the things that they began to do in an effort to tie together the northern provinces of Mexico, Texas, with the capital city of Mexico City, is they're going to open up their borders. Open up their borders. Basically, they're going to invite Americans to come to Mexico and settle it. It's hard to imagine, Americans immigrating to Mexico. But this is what happened in the 1800s. So, Mexicans began to encourage American farmers to settle in Texas, to become Tejanos. And they began to do this very early in their own existence, like in the 1820s, right after they gained their independence. So, what might they do to encourage people to settle in that area? Pay them with what? What do they got a lot of? Land. And that's what they did. They offered enormous land grants. And the way they would do this is they would have one person in charge. And they would say, okay, you're going to be in charge of getting this land settled. So we're going to give you, 100,000 acres of land. And then you go divvy it out amongst people. You go find families to settle on it. All right? And those people are called empresarios. Empresarios. That word, the E word. Empresarios. They're agents who help to get the land settled. And these empresarios, their job was to divvy out these land grants to settlers, to get people to settle there. That's how Mexico wants to develop this area with people. So the settlers would buy this land very cheap, very, very cheap. And then they would, it's a benefit to them. They get extremely cheap land. But Mexico had some restrictions. They put restrictions on this land and the people that wanted to move there. So they want people there, but they had a couple of regulations. Regulation number 1, they had to become Mexicans. They had to become citizens of Mexico. And they had to observe the official religion of Mexico, Roman Catholicism. So, a lot of Americans were really anxious to get this cheap land and settle it because Texas is typically really good for growing stuff. So, the most successful person, the most successful impresario is Stephen F. Austin. You ever heard of him? Austin, Texas, the capital of Texas today, named after this man. He was the most successful land agent or impresario. And he gave out over 297 land grants. Thousands of acres of land.
What was that number of acres he gave out?
I think like 4,428 acres. I'm just guessing.
I meant like grants that he gave out. I'm sorry.
297 land grants. Okay, so, and it was a sweet, sweet deal. Like, how would you guys like to get some really cheap land? He even sweetened the deal a little bit further. He exempted them from paying taxes for 10 years. Man, if I didn't have to pay taxes for 10 years, it'd be awesome.
Get free land.
And get free land. So word about this good deal was spreading rapidly throughout the United States. And you began to see posters popping up all over the Americans saying, go to Texas, or just simply GTT, go to Texas. Some people would abandon their homes that were in foreclosure, and they would just carve into the door, GTT, gone to Texas, because they're going to go get the cheap land and become Texas. So, a lot of people were confident that Texas would yield a great amount of wealth, and that's how it was set up. Now, a lot of people that were going to Texas were going there to do what occupation? Farming. What states do you think they were most likely coming from? Hey.
Hi.
What region of the country? Great cards?
Yep.
I'll give them out.
And then this is Miss Jordan, the new school counselor.
Hey, welcome, Miss Jordan. I'm John Moore.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
See ya.
Thank you. Where do you think they were coming from? The South. What? If you're an agricultural person in the South, what's something you probably have?
Land.
Slaves. They're getting land. Mexico doesn't allow slavery. The majority of people in the South, there are a lot of Catholic people there? No. Are they going to abandon their slaves and adopt a new religion? No. Stephen F. Austin completely ignored those two details when he was recruiting families to go settle there. He never told them about being Catholic. He never told them they had to become Mexican citizens. Well, do you see how this could be a problem in the future? Yeah, when hundreds of families, thousands of people were moving into a territory, bringing their slaves with them, bringing their Protestantism with them, and then Mexico's like, hey, you're not fulfilling your end of the bargain, America. So you can see where that's going to cause some problems. And so these people who were residing there never wanted to become Mexican citizens. They believed they were in America because they were Americans. And so eventually, over time, you're going to see tensions build up. And Texas eventually wants to become its own place. As the the white population of Texas, surged and tensions grew with Mexico over cultural differences, as well as issues of slavery, the overwhelmingly Protestant settlers that spoke English instead of Spanish and were Protestants and had slaves that were sugar and cotton farmers in Texas, they insisted that, they were allowed to do all these things. But they're totally breaking the law, completely breaking the laws of Texas. So Mexico said, okay, no more impresarios, no more land grants. We're going to seal our borders to Americans. And they slapped a heavy tax on the importation of American goods. So all those Americans that are buying things from America in Texas, it's going to cost them a lot more money. Now, Mexico does that, but how do you enforce something like that? If you want to put a heavy tariff on a group of people, how do you enforce that? If you're going to tax imported goods, how do you enforce that? Okay, where? At the border. If it's coming into our country, we need to see it. Well, Mexico doesn't really have the ability to do that because they lack the troops to police their own border. So despite the restrictions, all these tax restrictions and restrictions on religion and slavery, the population continued to grow of white people. More and more white people were being born in Texas, and more people were moving there. Like 1,000 immigrants to Texas per month. That's a lot. That's a significant amount, okay? People were streaming into Texas. All the while, the politics of Mexico are becoming more and more unstable. Pretty soon, Stephen A. Austin he gets rid of all of his land, all the land grants he gives out. And so he returns to Mexico City to see if he can get some more. And he goes there in 1833. And when he arrives there, he sees that the government of Mexico has been overthrown by a dictator named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. We'll just call him Santa Anna for short. And that's a picture of it. That's Santa Anna right there. And he visits, when Stephen A. Austin goes to Mexico City, Santa Anna hears that he is in town, and Santa Anna basically says, okay, all you people in Texas that are not obeying the law, I'm abandoning it. I am going to suspend your rights. I'm going to suspend the Constitution in Texas. And he put Stephen A. Austin in prison for inciting a revolution because he has welcomed so many people that are considered lawbreakers in the eyes of the Mexican government into their land. So when these people's rights are taken away from them, this is when Texas erupts into a revolution. Texas revolts against the American government, or against the Mexican government. Okay? And so, the Tejanos, the people who live in Texas, the settlers there, begin to gather weapons and arm themselves and prepare for fighting, war. When Santa Anna hears that the people of this area are preparing for fighting and are willing to fight the Mexican government, well, how do you think dictators take being challenged? Not very well. So he sends 4,000 members of the Mexican army to Texas. When that 4,000 member army arrives in San Antonio, they find an old Spanish mission called the Alamo. You ever heard of it? It's still there, right in downtown San Antonio. There's a picture of it. I had a friend that went there, and they said it's really weird because there's this old, crusty, stone-built Spanish mission, and then over here, there's like to the right and left of it are skyscrapers because it's right in downtown San Antonio. So it's pretty neat. Now, in 1835, basically some Tejanos had holed up inside of this old Spanish mission called the Alamo. And Santa Anna was leading his 4,000 men army. And when they come across this garrison at the Alamo, they surrounded it. And among the people who were inside of it were famous people like this man who was a frontiersman from Kentucky named Davy Crockett. You ever heard of him? Davy Crockett was in there. This man, his name is Jim Bowie. You ever heard of him? He's more known for a weapon that he created. A Bowie knife. It's named after him. Okay? They were inside the Alamo, defending it. And basically Santa Anna surrounded this place and attacked it and killed every single defender inside the Alamo. He only spared a few women and children. So a complete and total massacre of Tejanos, of Americans at the Alamo. And so when word of this massacre reaches America and other parts of Texas, that becomes their rallying cry. Remember the Alamo. Remember Davy Crockett and all the good, God-fearing Americans that were in there. And we're going to go fight in their honor. Remember the Alamo. All right? So, not the most important battle of the Texas Revolution, but it was important. Later, in March of 1836, Santa Anna was still on the move, and he had his troops execute 300 rebels at the Battle of Goliad. Meaning, he just had them shot. He lined them up and shot them, 300 people. So these, Santa Anna is gaining some victories. He wins the Alamo. He wins the Battle of Goliad. But they would prove very costly because the people of Texas are not the type of people that take things lying down. And when they hear of these injustices, they get really mad. They're massacring women and children and just like lining people up in front of a hole and shooting them and letting the bodies fall in the hole and just covering them with a little sand. This is bad stuff. This is like dictator, despot stuff. So 6 weeks after the defeat at Alamo, the Texans, they rally behind a new guy. And his name is Sam Houston. Houston? You ever heard of that place? Sam Houston. And Sam Houston begins to kind of stalk Santa Anna's army. And one day, near the banks of the San Jacinto River, S-A-M space, Jacinto, Jacinto, with shouts of "Remember the Alamo" being screamed, Sam Houston and his Texas rebels killed 630 of Santa Anna's soldiers in just 18 minutes.
630?
Yeah, and captured Santa Anna himself. The reason why he was so successful is because the Mexican army was having a siesta. Do you guys know what a siesta is? They were taking a nap. Taking a nap. And it's just a cultural thing. If you go to Mexico today from like 2 to 4, everybody taking a nap. They take a nap. All right? It's a siesta. So, yeah, sounds good to you? Yeah, me too. No, I'm not a big napper. But anyway, they capture Santa Anna and at gunpoint force him to sign some treaties. So those treaties are totally legit, right? Like, you're going to sign this or I'm going to shoot you. Not the most legitimate treaties, but they are signed nonetheless. One of the treaties he signs is called the Treaty of Velasco. Velasco. And what the Treaty of Velasco does is it says Texas is independent. So is Texas a state of the United States? Is Texas a state of Mexico? What does Texas become? A country. Its own country. The Republic of Texas. Texas was its own country. Also called the Lone Star Republic. Obviously, the people of Texas, what is their ultimate ambition? What do they want? They want to be a country? What do they want? They want to be a part of the United States. Look at their flag. What does a star represent on the American flag? A state. That's why they're called the Lone Star State, because they want to be another star on the American flag. And that's why they put one star on their flag. One star, one state. Lone Star State. Does that make sense? Okay. So anyway, they become the Republic of Texas. And it takes a little while for Texas to join the Union, because what does Texas have that throws a wrench into the works for as far as Congress goes? Are they going to be a free state or a slave state? Texas is going to be admitted as a slave state, which offsets the balance of power. So it takes a little bit of time. It takes about a decade for Texas to be admitted into the Union. But eventually it does. And when a place that is actually a country that gets admitted, it's called annexation. Texas is annexed. Other states like, West Virginia is a bad example. West Virginia was not annexed, but it was... Let me forget about that. Like, California was not annexed. It was made a state through the process of, they created a constitution. Texas was already a country, and so it was simply annexed.
What was Alaska?
Alaska was made a state just because it belonged to Russia, and it was not its own country. All right. California was a republic too, though. That's a bad example. Every other state but those and us. Okay. All right, annexation. So it just means to incorporate. And Sam Houston invited the United States to do that, to annex Texas. Sam Houston was the president of Texas, by the way. He became president. And he invited the United States to annex or incorporate the Texas Republic into the United States. And most Texans wanted this to happen. They hoped it would happen. But opinion on the matter was divided in America because many Southerners sought to extend slavery, to expand it. And adding Texas would do that. It would expand slavery in the United States. Whereas Northerners, they were afraid. If you add Texas, it's going to create more slave territory, and it would tip the uneasy balance of power in the Senate in favor of slave states. They thought it would also bring war with Mexico. All this while, guys, Mexico is like, that treaty we signed was garbage. Our guys signed it at gunpoint. Texas, you're not a country, you're part of Mexico. And so if America said, okay, we'll annex you, Texas, how would Mexico perceive that?
They stole from Mexico.
Yeah, like United States is invading our territory. And so a lot of Americans were fearful of the annexation of Texas because Mexico did not recognize the Treaty of Velasco. With good reason. It was signed at gunpoint. Okay? You know, the guy had just woken up out of a nap. He's got a gun in his face. Here, sign this. That's essentially how it went down. So, ultimately, I'm not going to, I guess I got to spoil it. We do go to war. The United States does go to war with Mexico. And Texas is a big part of that reason. Also, part of the reason is we have manifest destiny. And we want something that they have. California. And we end up getting it. But before that, Texas does become a state. It's the 28th state. And it happens in 1845 under the presidency of James K. Polk. And when this happens, a furious Mexican government recalls their ambassador from Washington immediately, and events quickly tumble into hostilities. And that's what we're going to look at the next time in lesson 3. Questions on Texas? Next time we're going to have war with Mexico. All right.